Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Chris Paddock. I work for an economic research consultancy called Hatch Regeneris, and we are in the midst of the biggest piece of economic research ever undertaken for the coastal capital area. So, bad news is you're not going to be able to see everything that's on these slides. There's a lot of information on them. Good news, there's opportunity to see this and a hell of a lot more evidence in the consultation pack that will be sent out and made available to you for the next 6 weeks. So if there's anything you can't quite see, feel free to ask the question at the end of this, but do be rest assured that it will all be there for you to wallow in over the coming weeks and think about and then consult on properly. So we've produced the economic profile, which is about 120 pages worth of economic analysis for the coastal capital area. That has been informed by 5 other research studies. There is a study into urban centres within the coastal capital area, the diverse range of towns and town centres and high streets that make up the economy of the area. There is a piece of research looking at commercial property, offices, industrial areas, retail across the area. There's a piece of work undertaken by our friends at Metro Dynamics looking at innovation and R&D in the area. There's a piece of work looking at skills that we've been undertaking, looking at skills and the labour market, and then there's a piece of work looking at digital connectivity. So as I said, a big wide range of information that I'm going to give you just a taste of today with a few thoughts of my own on what this all means, and then we can have a discussion after that. I will check my watch because this is a 20-minute presentation and there's a lot to get through. Okay, so understanding recent performance. When you produced your SEP, this was the sort of chart you built your SEP around. This looks at relative GVA economic output within the area per head within the coastal capital area relative to the UK and in comparison to other areas. And what that tells us is that the economic output per resident living within the coastal capital area has declined over the last 15 or 20 years relative to the UK, to a point now where the GVA per head is below the UK average. Now, GVA per head is actually a slightly alternative measure of productivity. When you look at the GVA per hour worked within the coastal capital area, things are ostensibly a lot more positive. So for every hour worked within the boundary of our area, that is worth £35 to the UK economy, and that's the 7th highest of all of the LEPs within the country. Good news, however, the gap between you and other LEPs has closed over that period, and other LEPs, like places like Cheshire and Warrington, which is growing very rapidly, South East Midlands LEP, west of England, are catching up and overtaking coastal capital. So when I looked at this chart, I thought, great, 7th in the UK, but no room for complacency, and actually, if things carry on as they are at the moment, there is potential that the LEP area will become less competitive over time. So digging down into this a little bit more, looking at recent employment growth over the last 5 years, this chart has all of your local authority areas. It has coastal capital in pink there, South East region in green, and the UK in grey. This looks at just employment growth over that period. Over the last 5 or 6 years, the LEP is 23rd of the 38 LEPs in terms of employment growth. And there's a great deal of variety between the different local authority areas in terms of employment growth over that period. When we look at business growth, things are slightly more positive. So 18th out of the 38 LEPs. Some areas growing very quickly. Croydon, Crawley, Brighton and Hove have all grown relatively quickly over that period from a high baseline. A lot of these places, you have to think about the baseline when you look at them, but things slightly better in terms of business growth. Actually, in the work that we do, similar economic strategy work we do for LEPs and cities around the UK, I think it's probably the more savvier places, the places that are more focused on productivity, that will focus on business growth rather than employment growth. because if you grow your business base, you tend to provide more high-value jobs within an economy, and that drives up productivity. So when you're thinking about the balance between employment and business, I think for Coaster Capital, business is probably the area that I would focus in terms of growth. However, statistics in terms of business startups are a very mixed picture. You've only got a few, I think 3 local authority areas that have a business startup rate above the UK average, and they are Brighton and Hove, Crawley and Croydon. So Gatwick, Brighton and Hove and Croydon are the big drivers of business startups within the area. A lot of places are way below the UK average in terms of business startup. And again, this story of disparity is something I'm going to come back to again and again within this presentation. A chart that you certainly won't be able to read is this one, which was provided by our friends at Metro Dynamics, but I think it's very interesting because it starts to think about the drivers of productivity within an area like Coaster Capital, and it gives us 2 different axes to look at. One is GVA per hour worked, which I've already mentioned, which is this one here, up the right-hand side, and then across the top, economic complexity, and that's their own measure of specialisation, innovation within the economy. And you have quite specialist activity. Your economy is very diverse, and your economy per hour worked is relatively productive. But what's happening is that's happening in silos. That's happening in specific nodes, specific businesses, specific places, and the benefits of that and the potential spillover agglomeration benefits that you might see in a successful economic region are not being redistributed around the region. They're going elsewhere. They're staying internally. So at the moment, the region's doing okay, and in specific areas, it's doing brilliantly. But the benefits of that are not being spread across the region, and as such, the sort of things clustering, development of more complex supply chains, development of more skilled careers and jobs are really not being realised as a result of the positive activity that's happening in certain locations, and that then has ramifications for what Julie was talking about in terms of social mobility and general improvement in places across the region. So our 5 research studies help us to understand why this is happening and why there is this kind of fundamental challenge within the region at the moment. I'm just going to alight on a couple of facts and slides from each of those and tell you why I think that the region has this challenge and the sort of messages that you need to be going back to, or Jonathan needs to be going back to government with in negotiating the local industrial strategy. So, first up is skills. Now, through the Skills Action Plan process, we are able to access research which tells us the most difficult positions to fill for local businesses. And local businesses, through the national skills research, tell us that there is a significant gap relative to the UK in terms of associate professionals. And that's a kind of funny definition, but these are people that do things in a business. So, you know, I have my own business, I employ a lot of people. It's the people who work for me are doing things. It's those doers which people are struggling to recruit. And when we've spoken to the bigger businesses within the Coaster Capital area, that's what they've told us. They said it is difficult for us to recruit and retain employable staff who will turn up to work, are well trained, are prepared to adapt to the changing needs of our businesses, and sort of do things and help us to grow. And whilst there are other gaps, I think that's the most significant one within that research. When we've actually talked to businesses as well, the labour market is so tight, businesses are reluctant to train people because they see that if they train people, then they're likely to move on and get another job elsewhere. So there's a barrier to people training, and most people get their skills being trained on the job. So there's a kind of dual challenge within the skills strategy in terms of finding the right motivated, skilled people to fill the position, and then keeping them and being able to invest in them in the long term. Something very specific to you. It's very rare that I would present a population pyramid. So a population pyramid is this chart on the left, which starts at 0 and goes up to 90 and 90 plus. And it shows us the number of people living within the area within different age groups, male on the left, female on the right. And then there's a line on the outside which shows a relative position. One of the big issues for Coaster Capital at the moment is there's not enough people aged 20 to 40 who are skilled working in the area, or indeed even living in the area and going off to work elsewhere. What you have got is a lot of people of retirement age or coming up to retirement age who are not being replaced within the labour market, and that's a significant challenge to future productivity and competitiveness within the area. Because if I'm a business looking to locate somewhere within Coaster Capital, I would look at this and I'd think, where am I going to get my workforce from? And one of the reasons for that, the chart on the right as you look, is housing affordability and availability. So every local authority location within the Coaster Capital area has an affordability ratio, which is the cost of housing relative to wages, above the UK average. In certain locations, Mole Valley, Chichester, Epsom and Ewell, where we are today, Tandridge, that's kind of up around 10, an affordable ratio of 10. So people need to buy a house in those locations. People would need 10 times the average wage paid in those locations. So affordability is a big barrier to providing a skilled workforce, we think. Okay, moving on to urban centres. There was a report in the news today about retail and about vacancy within town centres. This is the data that report used on vacancy. Now the report in the news, very bad news for the retail sector, was all about multiple retailers, brand names leaving the high street. This is a bit broader. It looks at just vacancy rate generally within each of the centres within the Coaster Capital area where there's more than 10,000 people living within a certain catchment area. You can see within that vacancy rates above the British average. Actually, there's only 7 centres with a vacancy rate above the British average. Croydon is the highest. Croydon, Newhaven and Ewell are the highest, with vacancy rates around about 20%. When we look at the change over time, more centres have seen a more negative change in relation to the UK, so it's certainly something to watch. Interestingly, when you look at the coastal centres, they seem to have been more resilient to retail shocks over the last couple of years. My theory on that is that they had their shock a while ago and now are probably more focused on local markets, and actually there's less multiples to leave because they actually left a number of years ago. The urban centres research is quite a detailed document, and it really shows us the diversity of this area and how different all of the places are across the Coaster Capital area. Certainly more so than a lot of the other LEP areas that we've worked in. What we've tried to do through that research is think about the types of interventions that need to take place in different urban centres, town centres, city centres, high streets within the Coaster Capital area. All of them need some sort of project or investment or intervention, but the type of intervention is different depending upon the capacity for growth, the economic need, the amount of private sector investment going into the area. And what we've started to do is develop this quadrant where we've taken a mix of different data sets, about 20 different data sets, and tried to define the centres on the basis of the opportunity and capacity for growth and the sort of greatest need to do something different and make good things happen. And what we get is different groups of centres. So in the bottom left-hand corner, we've got places where the need and the opportunity is probably less, and that's because there's less capacity to grow and change those centres. However, there is still a need to think about how they might evolve to changing markets and become more diverse in their offer. Moving up to the left, we've got centres where there's certainly a need to do something, but there's less capacity for growth. Places like Littlehampton, Shoreham, Lewis, Caterham. These are places that kind of need a short-term intervention to diversify high street uses, maybe bring some new economic activity into the centre. To the right, there are locations where there is both need and opportunity. So there's potential to grow, there's potential to diversify, but there is a need for investment, and there's maybe a gap in terms of the will of the private sector to invest in that. So maybe a more fundamental intervention is needed to bring forward master plans, to bring forward new commercial and employment space in locations like Chichester, Newhaven, Bognor Regis. And then the bottom quadrant are locations where there's certainly a big opportunity to do something significant, but actually we're already seeing private sector demand bringing that forward. So the role of an organisation like the LEP may well be to steward and guide that private sector investment over time. So this is very much a work in progress, and we would very much welcome comments on this through the consultation, but it's us starting to think about how we can start to group locations together in ways other than just their geographic proximity to something, so that the LEP can be more agile in how it responds. Right, commercial property is one of our fundamentals. As Jonathan's already said, there is huge demand for commercial property in a lot of locations across the LEP area, particularly within the Gatwick Diamond. When we look at rental and sales transactions, there's a significant amount of churn, and there's a significant amount of demand. There's a hell of a lot of demand in Brighton and Hove, but Brighton and Hove is very constrained by its supply, and increasingly you're actually seeing commercial development come forward across the coastal area to satisfy that additional demand that comes out of Brighton and Hove. Because there are challenges around supply, we've seen rents increase quite a lot over the last 5 years, particularly in and around Gatwick and the Gatwick Diamond area, but also down the Brighton main line to Brighton itself. We've seen less change in prices around rural West Sussex and the sort of western part of the coast moving down from Brighton. So we can see within the commercial study, and again this is a big study that I'm trying to summarise in 2 slides, that there's a ton of demand. I think the issue at the moment is generalising quite a bit, that the market is not providing the quality of space that the types of businesses that we would like to locate within Coastal Capital will demand. So when we start to analyse the transactions that have taken place, we can see that most of those, and this is a designation that's provided by CoStar, who provide us with data on commercial property transactions, there are very few, if any, office or industrial transactions above a 3-star rating, which is kind of average. Apart from a little bit of office space in Croydon, and then a very small amount of industrial space around Gatwick Diamond. Not providing that higher quality space is a barrier to the growth in the region's economy, and I think productivity, particularly when you compare it to your neighbours in Enterprise M3, to Oxfordshire, who are already bringing their list forward, and to London as well. If you look at lease deals in terms of quality, London LEP is clearly delivering much more quality office space than anywhere else, but Enterprise M3 is delivering more than you. When you look at industrial space, where there's a hell of a lot of demand at the moment, very little 4 or 5 star quality office space being delivered at the moment, compared to Enterprise M3, where 30% of the deals are in 4 or 5 star office quality. So in relative terms, I think there's a need to address that issue as we think about what we might do in the LIS. Digital connectivity. So this was a piece of work undertaken by Fifth Sector. I mean, there's a lot of good access to ultra-fast broadband in the region, in the urban areas, and actually that's pretty good when you compare it to the rest of the country. But some significant issues when it comes to looking at provision in rural areas where there are some quite significant, what we would call, not spots. The issue at the moment is investment in digital infrastructure is not particularly well coordinated, and businesses, I think, aren't really understanding the incentives that are available to them to help them invest in their digital infrastructure as well. So there are voucher schemes and incentives for businesses to invest in what is called fibre to the premises, the sort of best broadband that you can get, and businesses just aren't taking that up. So Fifth Sector have suggested two main intervention areas here. One is coordinating the spine of digital infrastructure that is future-proof for the long-term evolution of the coastal capital area, but then also playing a role as conduit in getting the information across so that businesses are investing in their own digital infrastructure, and when the opportunities become available are taking advantage of the fact that this is a trailblazer area in terms of 5G. So finally, Metro Dynamics, our friends and competitors have been doing some research into the innovation economy. As I said before, when I talked about their previous chart, they've identified a hell of a lot of internationally significant investment in R&D and innovation within the coastal capital area. They've started to look at where that's happening, and there's a significant amount happening in Manor Royal. There's a significant amount happening within Brighton and Hove, specifically around the digital sector. And then there's some really interesting stuff happening with the rural economy, particularly in West Sussex, where they're able to identify good, strong investment in horticulture and viticulture, which again sets the region apart in terms of what's happening when we compare it to the South East LEP and other LEP areas around the country. However, there isn't enough of this, and the benefits of this R&D activity are not spreading to other places, as I said before. There's a lot of detail within their report, but they think the main reason why this is happening is basically down to a lack of investment in R&D and innovation, and that is a lack of investment within universities. That is a lack of investment from businesses themselves, but very importantly, it's a lack of investment from government. The innovation assets that you have, the knowledge assets that you have within here, are just not receiving the amount of public sector investment in R&D that they need to be able to thrive. So again, in going into a negotiation with government on this, there's something very specific to talk about in terms of a conversation. Last slide from me. I was just asked to think about what all of this means for the evolving industrial strategy and how that might be structured. You're not going to be able to read these, so apologies. Point number one is really something that cuts across the whole local industrial strategy, and that is that this is not a single functional economic area. It is a collection of functional economic areas. And broadly, based on the evidence that we've analysed so far, you'd say you could split that into the area around Gatwick, some northern locations that are effectively commuter zones for London, and will probably always be commuter zones for London. The sort of rural area predominantly in mid and west Sussex, which, as I say, is becoming increasingly innovative and interesting as an economy and a functional economy in its own right. And then the area around Brighton, which is increasingly influencing the coastal locations, such as Newhaven, Lewes, Shoreham-on-Sea, Littlehampton. They're increasingly places that are within Brighton's economic sphere. I think by looking at the area in that sort of way, you're able to make more targeted and impactful interventions. The issue around around the age of the workforce. Getting more clever 20 to 40-year-olds in the area is fundamentally important. In the short term, addressing what businesses are telling us in terms of technical skills and employability is critical as well. There needs to be some relatively quick intervention within urban centres to address some of the challenges that we're identifying there. That's not just important to create nice places for us to go shopping and have a meal, but also to create the amenity that will stimulate the conversations that will stoke the fire of the innovation economy. This point about innovation and funding of R&D is critical, and that needs to be addressed in very short order through the local industrial strategy, and more funding for digital infrastructure is absolutely critical as well. And then finally, last but not least, provision of good quality, market-facing commercial stock, particularly around Crawley, and Gatwick and Brighton and Hove, is going to be absolutely fundamental to the economic future of the region. Okay, thank you.